Before Aquinas wrote his philosophies, he became a Dominican monk over the protests of his family and eventually went north to study, perhaps first briefly at Paris, then at Cologne with Albert the Great, whose interest in Aristotle strengthened Thomas's own predilections. Aquinas entered a theological program in Paris and studied the Old and New Testament intensely. Aquinas served a long apprenticeship, established his competence in stages, and eventually, after a public examination, was named a master, and then gave his inaugural lecture. That information comes from McNerney and O'Callaghan.
Love so bold to bring a revolution somehow. Now I'm lost in your freedom.
One of the most famous collections of proofs of the existence of God comes to us from St. Thomas Aquinas. He famously wrote his 5 ways of knowing the existence of God. The first one could be called the argument from motion. Something that is moved has to be moved by something else. So God is the prime mover and the starter of all things. The second argument is an argument from causality, that if something is caused, it has to have been caused by something else. And you can't have an endless stream of causes unless you have a beginning. So there had to have been a first cause. That cause, Thomas Aquinas says, is God. The third argument is an argument we could call the argument about contingency and necessity. St. Thomas says that if all things were contingent, anything that exists, at some point everything would cease to exist, and the universe would no longer be. So St. Thomas argues that there has to be at least one being whose existence is necessary to hold all things in existence, and that necessary being is God. The fourth argument is the argument we could call the argument from perfection. You could say, for example, that something is good or something is better, something is strong or something is stronger. St. Thomas says that if you're going to measure anything on some kind of a scale, there has to be one end of the scale, which is perfection. And St. Thomas says that is God. The final argument is what's known as the argument from design. And that's one which is pretty famous. The idea that we can look at the order of creation, look at the design of the universe. We can only imagine that some intelligent and benevolent creator was behind it. In fact, we know in the universe today of at least 20 constants, from the speed of light to the decomposition of carbon to the force of gravity. All of these things, were they any different, human life could not exist.
Aquinas' philosophy was known as Thomism. He is said to have created a subtle philosophy often described as Christian Aristotelianism, and his works were recognized as the basis of Catholic theology. Thomism came under attack, and many did not believe that philosophy and theology could mix. In response to this, in his Summa contra Gentiles, Aquinas stated, "The believer and the philosophy consider creatures differently. The philosopher considers what belongs to their proper natures, while the believer considers only what is true of creatures insofar as they are related to God. For example, that they are created by God and are subject to Him, and the like." However, Aquinas' theology was his philosophy. In Aquinas' eyes, theological discourse begins with what God has revealed about Himself and His action in creating and redeeming the world, and the world is understood in that light. Philosophical discourse begins with a knowledge of the world if it speaks of God. What is said is conditioned by what is known of the world. Theological discourse is led by the common principles of thought and being. However, it is distinguished by the fact that its arguments and analyses are taken to be truth-bearing only for the one who accepts spiritual revelation as true. When combined, philosophical theology is not some science distinct from metaphysics. It is simply the name that can be given to metaphysics because it appeals to God as the cause of its subject. This information comes from McNerney and Callahan, along with the Hutchinson Biography Database.
Who's gonna heal my pain? Nothing makes me feel like you do. Who can drive my demons away? Nothing makes me heal like you do. I love your mind, heart, body, and soul. You're the only sanctuary that I know. I don't need to stare at stained glass and a sting
Atheists have many theories that everything came from explosions, random floating materials that came together, or evolution. In the 1950s, scientists were in hot pursuit of the origin of life. Scientists around the world at the time had been examining what kind of environment would be needed to allow life to begin. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey took molecules which were believed to represent the major components of the early Earth's atmosphere and put them in a closed system. After this, they ran a continuous electric current through the system to stimulate lightning storms believed to be common on the early Earth. To the scientists' amazement, 2% of the carbon used had formed amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. Adenine, one of the organic compounds of RNA and DNA, was also created. Although these discoveries seem to have been enough evidence for a creation without a creator, they have been disproved. Despite the fact that experiments did create amino acids and adenine, the variables used, such as the amount and timing of electricity strikes, were not accurate to what would have actually happened. Apart from this, the elements that were enclosed in the experiment would not have been enclosed on the Earth. The question was then, if these compounds were not created in a reducing atmosphere here on Earth as Miller suggested, then where did they come from? We are more than just accidents or the results of explosions or evolution. We are unique individuals. With our own thoughts, feelings, and ideas, we are set apart from others. Yet, we are all made of the same basic components. The formation and complexity of our bodies unites us to a designer that carefully drafted us into the beings that we are.
Religion is you. You are my religion. My religion is you. You are my religion. My religion is you. You are my religion. My religion is you.